Hey, it's Jody Hamilton.
And Sean Smith-Pierce.
Here's a taste of what you might have missed from the Politics Bar.
Jody, I was listening to you this morning, filling in for Steph. You and Chris were debating, and just for the record, Jody is right. Chris's argument is that there is some truth to what's being said about the left being in their own information silo. Right.
Basically, we started talking about how Gavin Newsom has invited people on his podcast, high-up MAGA guys.
Yeah, well-known right-wing propagandists. That's what they are. Yeah.
And my argument is he shouldn't be inviting them because nobody on that side is listening to Gavin Newsom.
Right. It doesn't help to bring propagandists into a sphere where truth matters because they're just going to lie their asses off anyway.
Right.
So here is a public service message for Chris Lavoie. Jody Hamilton is right. Catch all that and more weeknights at the Politics Bar. Available through your favorite progressive radio station, your favorite podcast player, or online anytime at thepoliticsbar.com.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun.
Hi, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. This week I wanted to bring the past into the future and talk about how a 1945 government operations manual feels like it's offering a plan for making today's governments dysfunctional. And so, if you feel like your government isn't working for you, you're not alone. Around the world, governments that want more centralized control are using similar playbooks to fool their publics. And we're going to see some examples this week. Sound good? Let's get unspun. So the operations manual was the Simple Sabotage Field Manual. It was written in 1944 by the OSS, which was the precursor to the modern CIA, and its purpose was to train resistance members in German-occupied Europe in ways to disrupt operations from within. It's been declassified, and you can find it online, so I'll try to put a link in the show notes. But I would like to propose something this week. You know, that guide tells you how to make bureaucracies and governments stop functioning, and it was written for resistance movements, but I think it offers a playbook for anyone who wants to make a government stop functioning. And I think that a lot of countries that are flirting with authoritarianism right now, you know, those sympathetic to autocracy rather than democracy, are doing things, in some cases malicious incompetence, that are having the same effect. And I think the media is helping. So in today's episode, I want to go through 5 tactics I think we're seeing from leaders that are hurting functioning democracies. Because when they stop functioning, people will turn to the authoritarians to get things working. So I want to go through 5 things. The first is providing bad information. And honestly, this has been kind of the whole focus of Unspun, trying to get you to be able to resist bad information. But let's look at a few examples. The world and the news that covers it is full of horrors and atrocities, but in 2014 Russia, there was a story that seemed like it might have topped it all. In February of 2014, Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula and took over government buildings and the airport. This was just part of a kind of an ongoing series of conflicts in the country between Russia and Ukraine. Now, just because I say that it was an ongoing conflict doesn't mean it didn't really matter to the people living there. I have a Ukrainian friend whose parents live in extreme eastern Ukraine, and they have to worry about things like if the shelling would stop long enough for them to get their crops in. But Russia's taking of Crimea in particular was denounced around the world. And one thing that Russia needed to do was to make sure that its own people were supporting its actions. And their solution was Tactic 1, intentional misinformation. A few months after that invasion of Crimea in July, Russia's state-owned Channel 1 published a truly gruesome story featuring a woman who claimed that Ukrainian soldiers had publicly crucified a 3-year-old boy in a Ukrainian city. And other Russian media reran and amplified that story. But journalists who visited that city that they talked about could not verify it. They could not find any witnesses, and they even noted that the supposed location of that crucifixion didn't actually exist in the city. This was intentional misinformation, and it seems like it was created to distract from or maybe justify Russian military action. And other reporting even suggested that some Russians volunteered to join military action in the region just because of that story. And that story was later retracted, but I think it's a good example of this tactic. The field manual gives several examples of how you can use these kinds of lies to support resistance. For example, it says you can spread false information about how passable a particular river is, or if someone asks you for directions, give them wrong ones, or tell them that a bridge is out when it's not, or something like that. Or if you're asked to train new employees, teach them the wrong things to do. Give them bad information about how things work. So here's another example in recent news. Last week, U.S. President Donald Trump gave a speech in which he stated that he would be declassifying information from the 2020 presidential election that he said proved that that election had foreign influence. Now, he did release information, but it did not prove that Joe Biden had lost the election. It was a reimagining of issues that were brought up in 2020 itself, when the president's campaign had multiple lawyers giving speeches and filing court claims about election irregularity, and they didn't win any of those court cases. In the U.S., we have 3 levels of government, and 3 of the attorneys who filed those cases and were giving those speeches, named Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis, and Kenneth Chesebro, they were all later convicted in Fulton County, Georgia, after they pled guilty to things like getting fake depositions from people, getting fake electors to cast illegitimate votes, and even sneaking into election offices to physically steal data. Now, the U.S. government itself, through CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, suggests that good and accurate communication is essential for fair elections. So when you think about a political leader who is hiring surrogates to not just investigate an election, but to do things like this that are, by their own confession in court, illegal lies, that seems like intentional misinformation. So that was number 1. Number 2 is related: strategically spreading rumors. In the Simple Guide, this includes doing things like telling someone, oh, this road, you can never get through it in the snow, or spreading plausible office gossip that keeps people putting out fires instead of doing their jobs. And we've seen this kind of thing done with presidential campaigns around the world. When Jair Bolsonaro, a former Brazilian president who is now convicted and under house arrest for leading a coup after he lost an election, was first running in 2018, WhatsApp was a big vector for rumors. According to Reuters Institute, Brazilians are some of the world's top social media users, and WhatsApp serves as sort of a hybrid between a social media app and a messaging app. In that election, Bolsonaro's supporters paid digital marketing firms to create viral rumors. For example, there was a massive rumor about Fernando Haddad falsely claiming that he had written a sexually explicit school curriculum for primary school students to encourage them to become gay. This was a complete lie. But using WhatsApp was a really strategic choice to share that rumor because A, it was free, and B, people are more likely to believe person-to-person messages, and that is how stuff spreads in WhatsApp. So this kind of strategic rumor sharing has happened in a lot of places around elections, including South Africa and India. And it has the same effect. It makes things less efficient. In Brazil, news organizations had to devote a lot of resources to fact-checking rumors instead of covering the issues about the elections. Another example happened here in the last presidential election. Have a listen.
What they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country, and look at what's happening to the towns all over the United States. And a lot of towns don't want to talk. It's not going to be Aurora or Springfield. A lot of towns don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed by it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country.
This was a quote from the last U.S. presidential election, and it represents a substantial sharing of strategic rumor. In September of 2024, someone posted on a Facebook group called Springfield, Ohio Crime, claiming that a neighbor's daughter's cat was butchered by neighbors who were Haitian immigrants. Some far-right social media accounts took up this rumor and they amplified it and made it even bigger, right? And saying that migrants were taking and eating ducks and geese in local parks. And then, later that month, then U.S. Senator J.D. Vance took up the rumor, posting on X that reports now show that people have had their pets abducted and eaten by people who shouldn't be in this country. That tweet got more than 11 million views. And by the way, it is still up, so I'm also going to link to that in the show notes. The reports he's talking about are things from influencers like Charlie Kirk and Elon Musk, social media posts that they made. And Vance wasn't even the only Republican in government to spread the rumor. At the same time, local officials were investigating and they said it was not true. But both Senator Ted Cruz and an account from the House Judiciary Republicans shared posts about this as well. In Arizona, a group even bought billboards and put them up. Now, that statement that we just heard from Donald Trump was from a presidential debate on September 10th. And as time went on, the debunking continued, but the rumors continued to spread, along with people's exhortations that they needed to vote for Trump or they needed to vote for Republicans to handle this problem that didn't actually exist. So this was strategic spreading of rumors, right? So Vance said in an interview with Dana Bash, if I have to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention to the suffering of American people, then that's what I'm going to do. So think about what he's saying there. It's okay to deliberately create and spread lies if it has a good effect. That's strategic spreading of rumors. So again, those tactics that are described in the Simple Sabotage Field Manual are being used to destabilize public trust. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we'll look at 3 more tactics that are showing up and how leaders damage the people they lead in the name of power. I'll be right back. Welcome back. So we've been through 2 tactics so far: intentional misinformation and strategic spreading of rumors. The third tactic is bad faith participation. This is basically when you participate in something, but you're pretending that you're something that you're not. So to enlist people to do acts of sabotage, you can, for example, pretend to be part of a large resistance. The manual suggests that people are more likely to want to work with you if they feel like you represent something big. So maybe you just lie about that. The manual also discusses doing things like calling officials to make false reports of things like fires, or pretending to be a concerned citizen reporting an incident. In recent time, we've seen examples of this, and one example that really comes to mind quickly is AI bots. So these are automated programs that can run accounts on social media, and they make all of the posts with AI. There's been other interesting ones. One that I saw relatively early is described in this clip from comedian Samantha Bee's show. Have a listen.
Can you give me some examples of some websites where you like to comment?
Сайт — это и Wall Street Journal, и New York Post, и Washington Post, и тот же Facebook, Twitter.
How many accounts would you say you have?
Near 100 Twitter, 20 or 15 in Facebook.
The woman in that clip does most of her interview in Russian, which is not really good for the podcast format, but she goes on to say that she spends her time acting as an American when she posts online in those, dozens or hundreds of social media accounts, and she's a housewife from Nebraska, for example. Now, a lot came out later about the Internet Research Agency from Russia. It was named in the Mueller report and some reporting about the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Samantha Bee's report, though, actually came out before the 2016 election. The comedian traveled to Moscow and interviewed people who were paid to post this kind of stuff. And as the woman in the clip says, she's pretending to be someone that she is not, a politically engaged American. And this is an example of bad faith participation. You will commonly see politicians do similar things when they are campaigning. For example, here in the United States, it feels important to show that you understand the values of people who live in very rural parts of the country, because rural voters are about half. One thing candidates will do is go to state fairs. So these are agricultural expositions in different states. And the candidates will be photographed eating a giant pork chop on a stick or something like that. These kind of photo opportunities are also an example of bad faith participation. Because rather than being the thing that the newsmaker looks like, the person who enjoys giant pork chops on sticks and pig races, they're kind of cosplaying, right? So they're instead taking that identity to use it for personal gain. All right, the fourth tactic is pretending like you don't understand what someone else means and using that to derail productive discussion. The field manual goes into this at some length. They suggest to advocate caution, that you should refer all matters to committees for further studies, that you should misunderstand orders and just ask endless questions. You should insist that unimportant things be done absolutely perfectly, and more things like that. And, truth seekers, we can come up with a lot of modern day examples of this. Honestly, it is one of the things that frustrates me the most about journalism today. I see journalists who have sources and people they're interviewing, and they do this kind of thing, and the journalists just let it go. There are a few different things newsmakers will try. So here's an example of one of them that comes actually from Congress.
Gone. And if I move from here and go over there and sit with my Democrat friends, which will make them real nervous, does Google track my movement? Does Google, through this phone, know that I have moved here and moved over to the left? It's either yes or no.
Not by default. There may be a Google service which you've opted into use, and if
So Google knows that I am moving over there. It's not a trick question. You make $100 million a year, you ought to be able to answer that question. Does Google know through this phone that I am moving over there and sit next to Mr. Johnson, which would make him real nervous? It's his question. It's yes or no.
I wouldn't be able to answer without looking at
Can't say yes or no.
without knowing more details.
If I walk over there and sit next to Mr. Johnson and carry my phone, does Google know that I was sitting here and then I moved over there?
You're welcome anytime, Judge.
Yes or no?
I genuinely don't know without knowing
I'm
what
shocked you
services.
don't know. I think Google obviously does.
So that was a U.S. representative named Ted Poe from Texas who was questioning the CEO of Google in a congressional hearing. The CEO is asked if the representative's phone could be used to track the representative's movements. And the CEO says he can't answer that question without specific knowledge of the representative's phone. The representative is clearly intending to ask if Google can track locations. And the CEO, by redefining the question to, is this phone in my hand right now configured to track my movements across this room that we are both in? He's being overly literal, and he's using that to evade the question. And when he's doing that, he is hiding the truth, right? So here's another example.
My plan is about saying that when you invest in small businesses, you invest in the middle class, and you strengthen America's economy. Small businesses are part of the backbone of America's economy.
But pardon me, Madam Vice President, the question was, how are you going to pay for it?
Well, one of the things is I'm going to make sure that the richest among us who can afford it pay their fair share in taxes. It is not right that teachers and nurses and firefighters are paying a higher tax rate than billionaires and the biggest corporations. And I plan on making that fair.
But we're dealing with the real world here.
But the real world includes...
How are you going to get this through Congress?
When you talk quietly with a lot of folks in Congress, they know exactly what I'm talking about because their constituents know exactly what I'm talking about. Their constituents are those firefighters and teachers and nurses.
This is Kamala Harris doing an interview when she was running for president. And so she was asked a very specific question about how she was going to get funding for a program through Congress. And her attempt to sort of avoid that question is an example of the word salad technique. Basically, this is throwing out a whole lot of verbiage that sounds like it's related or answering the question, but it doesn't answer the question. And when newsmakers do things like this, it makes it hard for people to make decisions because you don't really learn specific things about what a candidate believes or what they might do when they're in office. So far we now have 4 tactics. We have providing bad information, we have strategically spreading rumors, bad faith participation, acting like you are in one way when you are another, and we have derailing productive discussions. The last one I want to talk about today is exploiting the rules. In the operations manual, one of the things they talk about is basically working to specifications. And this is the idea behind something like quiet quitting. You do exactly what is required by your job and no more. And working to specifications can be very damaging if you work in any kind of area where it's hard to specify the situation perfectly. Here, let's imagine something. Imagine someone working at the ticket window at a train station. And so the rules say that they should take their lunch at 12 noon. But the flow of customers is irregular. And so at 11:49, you have a whole line of people backed up at the booth. And at exactly 12 noon, in the middle of a booking for someone, you just close your window and go to lunch because that's what the rule says. Or the specification is that you buy 5 gallons of gas at a time. And so you know someone is going somewhere, and given the fuel economy on the vehicle that you're sending out, they are not going to make it on 5 gallons of gas. But you follow the specification and you strand them 3/4 of the way to Avignon or wherever they're going. So that can be an example of causing chaos by exploiting the rules. And this has been co opted as well. One place where you see this quite a lot is in the relatively open access to posting on social media. From Russia's internet research agency making fake groups on Facebook to target items that might split Americans to that WhatsApp messaging around elections that we talked about earlier, the fact that most people have open access to post whatever they want on these platforms is kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, when you treat social media platforms and other online communications as what is called a common carrier, where the platform is not responsible for the content, that does enable freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And in many Western democracies, these are prized principles. On the other hand, it means there can be a whole lot of shenanigans. So let's look at a case. As I mentioned before, Facebook has been a huge vector for spreading misinformation. And between 2016 and 2024, there's been a quite interesting trajectory as far as the company's response to being that vector. So, for example, after news started coming out in the Mueller report and in the British media about Russian foreign interference during the election, Facebook actually made an effort to put up some defensive barriers against misinformation. And in December of 2016, they launched a massive program where they partnered with Snopes and other accredited independent fact-checking organizations to label false content. And they also tried to use their algorithm then to make it so that people would not see that content as often, which people will sometimes call shadow banning. And in 2017, they took aggressive action in deplatforming some groups who were using fake accounts to try to manipulate people. And then as we move forward into the late 2010s, this was sort of the peak time that Facebook actually intervened in the content that was posted on their platforms. They had dedicated elections operations centers for a while, which were actual physical places full of people trying to track disinformation ahead of major elections all over the world. But then the pandemic was a big turning point, where Meta, Facebook's parent company, started just deleting content they determined was threatening, what they called imminent harm, or they included posts that had health hoaxes and anti-vax conspiracy theories in them. In 2020, they even had an oversight board that was kind of an independent body that was judging their decisions. But as we moved further into the 2020s, there were market pressures on the business. And you need to remember that social media companies are businesses, and this started to take a toll. In 2023, the company started having mass layoffs, and this particularly hit the trust and safety teams. This was also the age of a push toward AI automation, and so some of the policy enforcement that was still happening was being done by AI, which made a lot of mistakes. And then came 2024 and the re-election of Donald Trump. And we'll talk in a second about how conservative lawmakers pushed back hard on any attempts to censor information, particularly with the idea that censorship was hurting conservative speech in particular. Government pressure was combined with a slowdown in the tech industries, and so they pivoted to trying to label AI-generated content and deepfakes, but not misinformation in general. But by late 2024, after the election, the company really pretty much rolled back its attempts to control information pretty hard. They said that they were accidentally censoring things and maybe over-enforcing, and so they decided that they were no longer going to use professional fact-checkers, and instead they were going to move to more of a community notes system. And at the same time, they lifted things like topic bans. So they had restrictions on topics like immigration and gender identity and election theories from 2020. They also changed their sort of safety net content, which was checked by AI, to only apply to things like very severe threats like child sexual assault material. It's been an interesting thing for the company, which is global, as the changes that they're making, I think in response mostly to American political pressure, are not playing well abroad. In fact, This month, in July of 2026, they were targeted by the EU and found guilty of creating interfaces in Facebook and Instagram alike that create vulnerable kind of addiction. And the reason I bring this case up is because I think that the company has been a major vector for misinformation, but they are largely pulling back from this in response to threats from the government. Here's an example of the kind of thing I mean. In Joe Biden's administration, he appointed a disinformation governance board. And so this was intended to be advisory to parts of the Department of Homeland Security on issues in disinformation and, other information problems. This included things like election interference, but it also included things like maybe human smugglers encouraging large numbers of potential immigrants to come to the border. Journalists called the rollout of this board, this disinformation governance board, bungled. For example, a Washington Post writer talked about how Homeland Security didn't talk to people in Congress in advance of setting up the board, and conservatives were pretty quick to criticize it and say it should be disbanded. Senators said things like that Homeland Security wanted to police American speech and it was going to be something like the Ministry of Truth in 1984. Even on the state level, there was a group of Republican attorneys general who said that they would sue the government unless the board went away. And although the Homeland Security Secretary said that the department could have done a better job explaining what the new board would do, he also said that the things conservatives were afraid of was the opposite of what would actually happen, because the board wasn't there to monitor people, and it really didn't have any power. It was just advisory. Generally, there were a lot of people who were concerned about the impact of such a board on Americans' right to free speech, which is guaranteed in the Constitution. So how does this relate? Well, if you think about it, there is a question about whether one useful purpose of a government is to protect citizens from harms. We do this with, for example, pharmaceuticals, where the government regulates what is allowed to be in medicines. We accept laws that restrict how you drive on a road so that people do not run into each other. And so protecting Americans from disinformation campaigns that might cause them not to get, life-saving vaccines, it could be a legitimate government function. But on the other side, you do have the First Amendment, which says that the government will not restrict people's speech. But think about it from the perspective of politicians. For them, speaking in favor of this information means speaking in favor of politicians being able to communicate misleading information as well. And when you see things like the vice president, when he's campaigning, saying if he has to create stories or lie to convince the American people of something, you can see where leaders might choose to take advantage of free speech protections. In other words, using a protection to actually weaken the country. And that's a tactic that the Field Manual would describe as sabotage. Okay, Truth Seekers, that's going to be it for this episode. I appreciate you hanging in there with me this week, and stay sharp, everyone.
Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
I'm Brian Karam, and I've spent decades covering politics. Now I'm taking you behind the scenes, one interview at a time.
Join us as each week Brian confronts the issues that matter, posing the questions you wish you could ask. No filter, no agenda, just the truth.
We're not here for sound bites. We're here for substance. Join me, Brian Karam, every week as we cut through the noise and get straight to it. This is Just Ask the Question, where curiosity will lead us to the facts.
Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform, and remember, when you want answers, all you have to do is just ask the question.